I'm Jordan.
And I'm Rosanna.
And on this podcast, we explore how to take life off autopilot
and relentlessly pursue a life worth living together. Welcome to Season 4, Episode 11 of the Relentless Pursuit podcast, Multi-Generational Influences.
Yes, let's talk about multiple generations at once. So this is not strictly a show about the kids. It's not a show about the parents, and it's not a show about the grandparents. It's a show about all three of those kind of intersecting. But outside of this is not about multi-generational households. We're talking about multi-generational influences. So looking at kind of the broader community in which primarily a child is raised and the way that that impacts their upbringing, the way that impacts their outlook on life, or the lack of multi-generational influences and the way that also can have impacts as well. So since I did bring up multi-generational households, let's just start there. That won't be the focus, but that certainly plays a role in what we're talking about. And I know that we were both looking at this, and I was kind of surprised to find that over the last 10 years, there has been a dramatic increase in multi-generational households in the United States.
Wait, why were you surprised? Because when I read that information, I was not at all surprised because I could, off the top of my head, realize what would impact that.
Right.
So why were you surprised?
So first of all, like a multi-generational household, we think, well, every household or many households have multiple generations, right? Parents and kids. So we're thinking like multiple generations beyond the typical like nuclear family setup. So it might be that you have like grandparents living in. It might be adult children living with their adult parents. Or other iterations of that kind. I was surprised because although I could name families that's the case, I guess I haven't just personally witnessed this increase over the last decade. So even though I can name specific, more anecdotal instances where that's occurring, I think to look at it statistically, and one website I said 1 in 4 American families is living in a multi-generational household. That really stood out to me.
Yeah, and if you haven't done the research or you haven't really thought about it, they attribute that to people are doing that for financial reasons. When parents welcome back their adult children to live with them for a while, it's usually to help them get back on their feet because of student loan debt or having the student loan debt and having a job, but it doesn't pay enough to kind of pay the bills. And so they welcome people back in. You see this a lot.
Welcome might be a strong word.
Well, yeah. Well, welcome might be a strong word. But
there are financial reasons to do that, right? You have multiple adult earners within a household, so that maybe helps just to maintain the household.
And then also to kind of help with childcare. So if you do need to be a 2-income family, if you have grandparents living with you that are able to assist in childcare where you're not paying for childcare, but you have people who live with you who can help you raise your kids and provide care for you in the home, then that's also a benefit so that you can both work to earn an income. Mm-hmm. But I mean, we've seen this a lot with, friends, you're in between buying a house. And so where does everybody land for a while?
Right. You end up with no matter how old you are, you end up with your parents, or sometimes it's the reverse where your parents may be downsizing and end up living with you.
Yeah,
and
that happened to us.
That's temporary. Yeah, that's very transient. So what we're seeing is a little bit more permanent or long-term.
Intentional selling
multi-generational
homes and then coming together in one place.
Yes. So we won't necessarily strictly get into that, but I think that's one of the first things we think of when we think of multi-generational influences. So I know many listeners may live with parents and children for various reasons, and I think that that's just part of a growing trend. In fact, if you look historically, that this was relatively common. And so over the last century, especially in North America, it's kind of the abnormal approach to not have such tight-knit multi-generational living.
Yeah. I mean, when both of my parents came here from other countries, they came here because an extended family member had already settled roots here. And they lived with them. So you're talking 2 and 3 different families living within one small bungalow or apartment in Chicago to help whoever came to the country get on their feet to provide something else for their family. And so you're talking about living with aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents simultaneously to strengthen some kind of base and foundation and community to get people on their feet.
Right. So I want to include that in the mix here, but we're talking about really as we'll look at this primarily from a child's perspective, but when they have interested adults in their life who are not their, or in addition to their parents, that is considered a very, very strong asset. And so this could include, I'd say, like any well-meaning, interested adult. So I think teachers are the first people that come to mind as part of that broader community. Of course, we think of like grandparents and just like all extended family. But I want to use the word community in a very intentional sense as well, where it's kind of this circle of influential personalities around the child. And along with that are the traditions and the organizations and the institutions through which that community is facilitated. So to illustrate this, I want to bring up actually, this is perhaps my favorite animated film, Moana.
I cry every single time. That is by far the most beautiful movie. I love it.
It is. It's a great film for a number of reasons. So I don't want to get on my high horse about its accolades. But one of the first things that the film seeks to establish is that the main character, Moana, she is a princess, but a very atypical kind of Disney princess. But she lives on an island surrounded by this whole community and culture of people. And what we'll talk about a little bit is that she has like what I would see as typical like teen angst about like who is she, and kind of almost like wanting to establish her own individual identity as distinct or separate from that culture. So the film takes on like really interesting nuance with that. But for the purpose of illustration, like recognizing that she's not just an individual like living at home with her two parents and then that's it, and everyone else is just considered someone else, right? There's this really like tight-knit understanding, like who you are cannot be distinguished from the people and the culture who surround you.
Okay.
So I look at, in terms of community, like just asking ourselves, what are some of those multi-generational influences or institutions? So the first one we look at is, I would say, like grandparents, elders within the family. But we also have, take religion, for example, and I don't know how many listeners may consider themselves religious, but one of the best perks of being involved in a religion is the community and the tradition, and even the kind of the ancient practices that one who grows up within that faith is able to adopt and see for themselves.
Well, and even as a child within that community, like you're being taught and led by a series of other adults at all different ages. So it could be someone, if you're 3, it could be anyone from like 15 to 90. And so you're seeing like a wide spectrum of people who are older than you, that know more than you, who are helping care for you and lead you and guide you. So it's like a very diverse community of elders.
Exactly. And it's like the adults are kind of maintaining that spirit of community. And religion is especially good in many instances of having certain ceremonies to mark milestones towards your becoming a part of that community. Like I think of like in Judaism, you have the bar mitzvah. I think it's when a boy is 13. Sort of like this coming of age ceremony where you're like recognized as becoming a young adult within this broader community. In Catholicism, you have confirmation.
You have baptism, you have communion,
right? There's a whole
you have
process.
Confirmation, right? There's a long series of steps to help you grow into your community and into your faith and into your identity as a person.
Yeah. And so what you have here, and I'll list a few other things where this is echoed, is you have men teaching boys how to become men, and you have women teaching girls how to become women. And so let me list a few other instances where this comes up. Religion is in North America and really all over the world, in many instances, kind of on a decline. We're seeing the erosion of some of these ancient practices, but it's not the only venue where some of that multi-generational influence can be there. I listed Cub Scouts as just another example, right? You have in many instances distinguished by gender, but having like boys coming together or girls with Girl Scouts like coming together, being led by men or being led by women, and like taught how to be a successful member of this community, how to be a virtuous adult. I think of sports in many ways, the new religion,
Yeah, for a lot of people.
right? And same thing, like you have, again, a lot of these are going to be distinguished by gender. They don't have to be, but you have like sports where you have the coaches and the assistant coaches, in addition to the parents coaching these young boys and coaching these young girls about sports, and through that the lessons of life that sports and athleticism and health and sportsmanship all contribute to. So it's not necessarily like this intentional institution that's been created for that purpose, but that's certainly one of the primary functions. And most of us have our kids participate in sports not because we foresee them getting that college scholarship or going pro, but because we see kind of this more like communal virtue that's
Right.
a part of it.
And learning, and it's important even as parents that obviously you're leading and teaching your children, but there's also an invaluable experience when your children are led by others in their strengths, right? Like, I'm not going to be a volleyball coach, but, if our kids are playing volleyball, right? Like there's something that someone else specializes in that they can teach them. But it also, shows them how to listen to and work with others. And so it's really important.
Yeah. So that's what really we're talking about with these multi-generational influences, is this idea that, at least from as we look at a child, and if the array of virtuous adults who surround them and are teaching them how to become an adult themselves. So, and I don't want to get too alarmist, but I wanted to talk about just modern trends. If we could like become like the old person in the room for a few moments and look at the way things are now, complain about culture and society a little bit, because what we see is, like I alluded to with religion, kind of like the erosion of some of the factors that have for generations really been a bedrock of facilitating these multi-generational experiences.
Okay. So what are some of those factors?
All right, so there's several. I'm going to list a few, and then I'll get into a little bit more detail about some of this. So first of all, this list comes from, I read from an author. His name is Leonard Sachs, Dr. Leonard Sachs. He's written several books, much of which kind of point to some of these elements. So he talked about the breaking of bonds across generations. And just one illustration that he gives for that is like back in the day, in the good old days, for instance, you might see like a grandfather, a dad, an uncle, and a teenage boy all kind of like bent over the hood of a car. The radio's playing, they're drinking their Cokes or their
Root
beers
beer.
or whatever, right? And kind of having that dimension to it. Now, it's very rare that you just kind of see, these members of the family hanging out.
Right. Just hanging out together in general.
Right.
But even in that case, like working on something together, kind of teaching and sharing an experience together.
Yeah.
That side by side.
So we'll talk about some of the factors that contribute to that. Another element is the prioritizing of peer relationships over a parent-child relationship. So a lot of what we're going to end up saying is it's going to be like, it's the parent's job to do X, Y, and Z. So we see certainly kids need friends, but they also need adults in their lives. And a parent specifically, they can do very different things than what a peer can do. So we'll get into that. Leonard Sachs talks about the culture of disrespect, kind of like, Miley Cyrus with her middle finger, Eminem, kind of like this celebration, especially with teen culture of like individualism and giving the FU to society and to institutions and to any type of authority that attempts to guide or to dictate. There is, of course, like screens, just the proliferation of screens that have customizable, portable entertainment. And this is primarily video games, for boys and social media for girls in particular.
And there's so much to say there. I mean, you could have seasons of shows all on that. But even like,
Yeah, I mean, this is his entire career.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, as a kid, you had like 7 options of channels, right? If you didn't have cable, and so when there was nothing on, right, you were bored with the TV, and you had to get up and go and move and do, or interact with people. But now it's like, well, if I don't like that, let me find something that will tickle my fancy, and so that I don't have to interact or not be bored or figure it out.
So one of the interesting things that is brought up is that, there used to be a very limited number of channels, and thankfully, like you didn't have the option of everyone having their own screen or everyone like choosing what it was that they watched at any given moment. So even though a screen is involved, at least the family would be looking at the same one and experiencing the same experience.
Right, watching the same thing
You
at the
gathered
same time.
together, right? And so, this isn't strictly about parenting, like with screens, but there's a few recommendations, like don't allow your children to have screens in the bedroom, simply because then everyone is in a different room with a different screen, and that adds to the isolation and the irrelevance of one another. And what that heightens is when the parent's role in a child's life is diminished, then what fills that gap? That's children. That's when the peer-to-peer relationship becomes more important and more established, and that's also when culture like will step in and will teach and will dictate. And in a lot of instances, when you think about like what are the most popular videos or the most popular TikTok trends, or like what is the kind of entertainment and culture that our children will gravitate towards, a lot of it is not positive. But kids don't know that. It requires an adult who knows
To step in.
to teach them. So if you don't know, if your kid is on a screen in their room and you don't know what it is that they're accessing, then there's no way to discuss or to guide or to
Right.
limit.
To monitor, yeah, content and language and
Exactly.
song. Yeah.
So I just have a few quotes here. There is just an observation about certain shows, like even on the Disney Channel, which we think like, oh yeah, Disney Channel, just open access. As long as you're on this network, you're fine. But that's not necessarily the case, and it hasn't been the case for a long time. So they quote shows like Liv and Maddie, Jesse and Dog with a Blog. It presents adults as clueless, out of touch, irrelevant, and or absent altogether. Then you have other personalities like Justin Bieber, Miley Cyrus, Eminem, Akon, and Nicki Minaj, all other ones who, again, are dismissive of guidance. I'll just put it lightly like that. So there's certain accolades about them as artists and performers as well. I don't want to be entirely dismissive. But kids used to value their parents' opinions over the combined opinion of their friends. And I think you and I would both say, like, we grew up with that mindset.
100%, yeah.
And I think a lot of children still feel the same way. However, this is no longer the case across the board. It's this reprioritization of the peer relationship over the parent-child relationship. So kids don't automatically know like what has value and what doesn't, and they must be taught. But when they're teaching each other, or when culture is teaching them, the result of a positive benefit may
Or a
not
healthy,
be guaranteed.
message or the truth, is skewed.
Yeah. So if we don't teach them, or what I would say, this is not strictly parents, but like if they're not surrounded by a healthy community of adults who are teaching them, then kids are going to teach each other, and they're going to turn to popular culture. So there's, and this has been a trope for a long time. Like I remember growing up, and people looked at like Al Bundy and Homer Simpson as the dopey dad,
Right.
right? And of course, Homer Simpson is still around, but it's kind of this impression that like, well, what role does the father play? And you look at the difference in how fathers are depicted on television across different generations, and now it's kind of decrying that the father is kind of someone more interested in drinking beer and watching TV than they are in raising their children or themselves becoming a man of virtue. So that's not to say there aren't good examples there, but what are the most powerful influences on children? Is it popular culture, and what from popular culture is drawing their attention? Or is it their own parents? Is it their own family that very specifically wants what's best for the child?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to digest. It's a lot to think about. And it's kind of a lot to challenge yourself with in terms of how you raise your family, how you structure your family, where you choose to live, what communities you choose to be a part of, and even how involved you are in those communities. Because you could sign your kid up for baseball and drop them off and walk away. But, how important is it for you to stay and watch a practice or watch a game to see the kind of men that are stepping in to coach and wondering, is this the kind of role model I want in my kid's life?
Right. So I would say that the typical sports coach is like the kind of coach who's like, all right, winning isn't everything. Let's do our best. Let's have sportsmanship. But there are more intensive coaches, more intensive leagues and situations that it may become unhealthy as well. See, I think the challenge with a lot of this is that there's certain cultural pressures, and we've talked about this in previous episodes too, where the parents are very busy and themselves are pulled in multiple directions, where it becomes more difficult to facilitate and to monitor the kinds of activities that your children are involved in. And so screens not only have become in many instances like the babysitter, kind of the default entertainment, but it's where children are going for their knowledge of the world. And so it's very difficult because screens are everywhere and so easily accessed, and the entertainment is so easily customized and shared. It is really a full-time job as a parent to kind of try to shut out what you don't want your child exposed to, and to bring in and to facilitate and be a part of what you do want them exposed to.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's where those multi-generational influences help, right? Like, because we can't do it all or monitor it all. So who else is in the lives of our kids that's, building into them? And even not reteaching, but a little bit kind of reiterating the values and the truths and the mindsets and the mantras that you teach them. We have good kids. I would say that my brothers and I were good kids growing up. And it's like you hear it from your parents, and not that you don't believe them and not that you don't trust them, but how much more impactful is it when you hear other adults that you know, love, and respect reiterate those same truths, values, mindsets? It's like, oh, maybe my parents are right, right? There's always like that resistance to listen to parents. But when multiple people are teaching the same thing and believe in the same thing and want the same thing for your kids, right? It's easier for them to like understand it, to believe it, to live it, and to follow it.
And so it's all kind of like reinforcing that same ideal. And like we said before, like you have this group of interested adults like teaching young men and young women how to become a successful adult themselves. But in I would say particularly in American culture, there's this idea of, I think, an often warped idea of success, right? If you think you're successful, then we conflate that with being virtuous, and those are not the same thing. And of course, individuality is, I think, nowhere on earth better expressed than in American culture, where it's often a setup where we have been told, and we tell our kids, like, you can be anything that you want to be, you can do anything that you want to do. But what that leads to is kind of this removal of any sort of framework. So, so that someone can become whoever that they want to be. I think that increases the anxiety that someone, and this is echoed in some of the things that I read as well. Whereas if you have like a strong community, going back to Moana's example, where, you kind of, there are elements of who you are that you see that's connected to something bigger than yourself, rather than something you have to build from the ground up, then that is an asset. And so there's other research as well about, they call it the immigrant paradox. Maybe there's other names for it, but how children raised within families who have recently immigrated to the United States tend to have lower levels of anxiety and depression than children who are raised in well-established North American families, because of that extent of community and tradition that is part of that family versus the degree of individuality that's emphasized.
And I would agree with that. I would say coming from a more ethnic family, you're kind of told and taught from a very young age, this is who we are, this is what we do. And there's comfort in that, and there's direction in that, and there's kind of like a plan, and like you feel like you fit somewhere and you kind of have a purpose. And now I don't think that means that excuse me, you can't be different than anybody in the community, or you can't express yourself in your own way, but to know that you're supposed to be kind and that you're supposed to be generous and that you should, think of others before, like teaching those things lets you have like a framework for who you are, right? And then on top of that, you can add your preferences, right? I think about it, and this is maybe a funny experience, but like in like fast food experience, like you're gonna go and you're gonna order like a hamburger from Portillo's, right? And so it comes with these things. It's like basically you're getting the meat and the bread, and so the rest is up to you. Like, right? You're having a hamburger, you're the meat and the bread, but do I want lettuce, tomato? Do I want the ketchup on it? Right? You can customize it to be whoever you want to be. But when at least there's like a framework for like what it looks like and how it's presented, it's like, okay, there's a good start, and then you get to build from there. But yeah, when you're left with nothing and told you could choose anything and do what you want, like I feel like that's hard for people to like figure out.
How do you develop a sense of identity then? And then this is where it gets confusing as well, because you might look at like certain examples of, I would say of young men or young women in society, and it kind of intrinsically know, like that's not me. It's not who I want to be. That's not like, if that's what being an adult looks like, then I kind of don't want a part of that, right? When we're thinking about our more negative influences, whether it's overt violence or sexuality or whatever. And so then it becomes like this aversion to wanting to grow up, or this feeling of like I don't measure up to whatever this kind of exaggerated seeming ideal is. But there's no core to come back to that's been established by the community to say like, oh, this is what's normal. This is what I should strive for, as opposed to what I may be seeing.
So do you want to talk more personally about just the influence of like multi-generational experiences, influences, households personally?
Yeah. Let's talk about us. You want to go first or second?
Sure. I mean, I can go first. So growing up, we lived, the five of us, me, my two brothers, my parents, but we never lived far from grandparents. Grandparents lived very close.
Well, your most of your extended family was in the same town, right?
Well, I was going to get there.
Oh, sorry.
Everyone lived in Chicago and then started to slowly come out to the suburbs. But it's funny because it's not just like one family came out to the suburbs and like came to one suburb, and then one went to like a really far south suburb or a really far north. Like everybody came here, they were in Chicago, and then everybody kind of moved together. And so I would say 95% of our relatives for 95% of my life all lived in the same town, right? Good schools, churches, close to family. And that was very important. Maybe coming from a different country and staying together was of the utmost importance to everybody. And even if people did not necessarily get along, it was it was important that everybody was close. So we're talking both sets of grandparents, all aunts and uncles, all cousins, like went through the same school. So it's like we were all close. Yeah. And so you'd be at the grocery store and you'd see your aunt. You'd be at the grocery store, you'd see your grandma. And we spent time at each other's houses, and
You just pop into your cousin's house and play.
Correct. Right. It was, people would just like stop by all the time. Growing up, there was always time for family. And so on the weekends, it's like you took turns visiting people. So like I would go to a great aunt's house or a great uncle's house, or even, my uncle's family's house. So like on the other side, not blood related, because that's what people did. They visited with each other. They spent time together, retelling stories of the old country, retelling stories of like the plights of like coming here and what they built. And And the kids weren't in another room on a screen. They weren't in a playroom full of toys. Like, we're talking, these are old people, old Italian people who had some stale cookies that you didn't like out, plastic on the furniture, one channel on TV that was probably in Italian. Like, and so because you couldn't be distracted by anything else, you sat and you listened to the stories. Yeah. You sat and
Could
you
you?
listened.
I always
sat and
imagine
you
everyone like
listened to
in the basement, like playing games and running around with the cousins.
when we were like being at grandparents' houses, yes. But there were times that we were expected to, if we were guests at like somebody else's house that was like older from the community, you sat, you didn't move, and you listened to everything. Mm-hmm. And then to show respect, you'd like get up and help clear tables in between, and like that's how you proved that the experience and the time together was worthwhile. You sat and you listened, and then you helped, and you were taught that, and it was an expectation. And there were times when, as kids, you can't help but be antsy. Right. And my brothers and I were, like I said, we were very like mild-mannered children. Also, I think my dad scared the bejeebers out of us when we were little about listening and obeying. Yes. So like, I didn't even have to get the pinch. I got the look, which let you know you were going to get the pinch and probably a spanking after. But it was like these expectations of listening to those who have gone before you, listening to those who have struggled, listening to the stories in a different language most of the time. Yeah. So there were times that I would, lean over and just be like, what was that word, or what did that mean? And this curiosity about the culture and the meaning and the expression in the stories.
Right, you're not just tuned out on your own, Nintendo Switch at the table. So you're a part of it as much as a kid could be. And in those instances,
over time, so we're talking about, this is like in the height of the 80s and 90s, and now we're in 2020. So my parents, I'm first generation American. Now our kids are, right, even removed from that. Our kids, we've never lived really that far from my parents. Actually, farther than probably my parents had ever lived from their parents when we first got married, and could only afford something smaller, and couldn't afford in the town where everybody was living. But I mean, now we're like less than a mile from my parents. We're in the same town, in the same community. We just walk there with the dog. My parents come here for dinner. We go there for family dinners. My parents host family dinner. So that the cousins are together and the siblings are together. My grandma is in attendance. She's our last living relative in terms of a grandparent.
She's the old matriarch there.
She's the matriarch. We still do things with our extended family, right, with like weddings and that thing. But now that the clans, I would say, have grown, that all of the families who have children who are now having
it's hard because now your aunts and uncles are themselves grandparents, or right.
Right. My aunts and uncles are grandparents. Individual. Those great aunts and uncles that I grew up with, for the most part, have almost completely disappeared. And so there's a dying generation, really. Yeah. And so it's left to us to like continue that influence. But now, even when we're all together and our kids are there, it's a different experience for them than it is for me. And so I can see that part, that erosion of multi-generational culture and influences within like an ethnic community. Yeah. Now they're getting more with like baseball and coaches and neighbors and all of that. Part of it, yeah. It's very different. There's a shift that it's not so much with family, but that circle has expanded.
Yeah. A couple observations, and then I'll share my upbringing. One is, this may not mean anything, but I've noticed that you mentioned like starting in the city and then moving. It's always been westward, like further away from the city, if you notice.
Yes.
So it started in the city, and then it was to Itasca. And then
technically Wooddale.
Wooddale, right. And now we're, not that we're like so far removed, but now we're in Bloomingdale, which is
7 minutes further west. Yes.
Which is further west. But then we have relatives as well who have moved even further west, right? Right. And so we're all suburbanites to different extents. But I just think that westward motion is interesting. And I'm sure if we looked into it that there's greater trends that can speak to some of the reasons behind that. So I don't think that observation means anything. This one does, though. I'm reminded of Sebastian Maniscalco. I think I said that right.
Yeah, who's coming to United Center in December.
Okay. And so Relentless Pursuit, folks, if you guys want to go see Sebastian Maniscalco with us in December, I guess we're going to...
Oh, are we going?
So let's go.
Save your dollars.
So, but I was going to say, like, he has a routine, and it's comedic, but also sad at the same time, because he talks about the difference in, like, this kind of the prior generation of visiting one another. And it's very common, like, there's a knock at the door, and you used to get, like, super excited, like, oh, who's it going to be? Oh, we got family here. Come on, take out the cookies. Let's make the coffee. Come on in. Now, someone knocks at your door, you, like, turn out all your lights, and you're peeking out the window, like, who the hell is doing this? Like,
No, everybody has a Ring doorbell but us, so they just look at their phone. They don't have to get up.
Exactly. But just that tradition, that habit of visiting one another seems weird now. Now you feel like you're intruding on someone. If you
And
just
you have to schedule it, and it has to be a date on the calendar nine
we're
months
all
in advance.
oddly busy.
Yeah.
So I see that as in a way like something lost as well. But we'll talk more about modern, like some of the things we're doing now with ourselves and with our old kids. Let me talk about my upbringing just briefly. I'm not a recent generation of immigrants, very very white. Even though my dad was, I would say, like arguably Italian, but we grew up. It was me. I had two sisters, two parents, and great household. I would say, even though family and extended family was a part of my upbringing, I say it's a very, very muted part. Spent most of our family gatherings with my dad's side of the family because they were the only one in the area. And even they were somewhat spread out. I had grandparents. We lived in Roselle. I had grandparents in Schiller Park, and I had aunts and uncles in Carroll Stream. And so really the only time we saw one another, if you guys aren't from the area, you can look up these towns to see about how far apart they are. But really the only time we would see each other is if it was like a birthday or a
occasion.
holiday. Yeah. And it was scheduled. Very rarely was there the visiting that you said occurred with your family. And then with my mom's side of the family, I'm not even sure like how long they've necessarily been established in America, but very spread out. My mom has three siblings, and really only met one of her siblings, I would say 3 or 4 times in my life. We had like a traditional pilgrimage to Georgia when I was growing up to visit my grandparents and one of my mom's other siblings. And like just so her family was just always spread out. And it really had to be an occasion to go and see any one of them. Or to
Yeah,
have
like
them
we
see
got
us.
married, and that was like the first time that clan had like really like all come together.
Right. Yeah, we had a family reunion in like 92. And then the next time we all saw one another was when we got married in 2006.
Yeah.
Right. And it's been, I think there's one other reunion since then in like 2012, 2013, maybe more recently. But anyway, like, so, I mean, all that makes the point. Like, we kind of grew up with a much more spread apart family. For me, I would say, my parents were very religious, and part of, like, you talked about how your upbringing, part of it was, this is who we are. And that could be another episode too. Like we had the episode, You're My Person. We could do another one like, these are my people.
There you go.
So I was kind of raised with the idea that your church community, these are your people. And that played a much stronger role in my upbringing for quite some time as well. So we spent as much time as you spent with your family, I probably spent at church doing all the things that come with that. So that played a big role certainly for me. And really one of the things I've noticed with my family is kind of the spreading apart of us once again. Like we're all from this area, the Chicago suburbs, but now oddly, both of my sisters and my parents live within like the same area by Fort Worth, Texas. They all kind of ended up there.
Well, they all ended up there, but your sisters
Not by
have
design,
all
yeah.
lived in like 3 or 4 different places since they've been married as well. So it's like there's the constant motion of people moving, and your parents were always here, and now they're all there near each other.
Right. So I'm envious of that fact that now we have to make like an annual pilgrimage down to Texas. And it's a great excuse to have somewhere to go, like for a vacation and for something different. But at the same time, a lot of the day-to-day interactions that we kind of grew up somewhat accustomed to with our families is a little bit harder to come by with my side of the family.
Right. But I think the role that like my family and even your family played in your life dictated kind of how we wanted our family situation to be once we had kids.
Well, and let's get into that a little bit. So now, as parents who are a little bit more aware of the multi-generational influences, we want our kids to be exposed to. How would you describe the lay of the land now? What is it? What should it be? That's not.
Grandparents on both sides have always been important in the lives of our kids since the moment our oldest was born. We have had, even before our kids were born, because we have had weekly family dinners with your family and mine since we were married. That was something I remember my mom had this conversation that, like, once you guys are married, my brothers still lived at home at the time. They were not married. We want you to come and have dinner with us. And then we did the same thing with your family too, that we would go and have dinner with them. And so family has always been a priority and being in touch with them.
And dinner has always been, like we talked about food, it's always been the occasion, right? The excuse
that
to gather.
We all eat dinner. So we would gather around a table once a week. We do it with your parents during the week. We always did it with my family on Sundays because there was always the Sunday family dinner, Italian kind of tradition for us. And until your parents left, we were still doing that with our 4 kids. And with my parents, what's great about having them right here is we walk the dog and we stop by. We go on a bike ride, we stop by. But my mom hosts an every other week family dinner. There's how many of that? Is there 15 of us?
Something like that.
Right? It's our family, my brother John's family and his kids, my brother Anthony, my parents, and my grandma, who is still alive and in the area. And so we are all together. We are 1, 2, 4 generations of people under one roof, breaking bread. Talking, yelling at kids, spilling milk, like the whole thing. And the cousins play and they, listen to their grandparents and they listen to their great grandma when she has something to say. And it's still a part of it. Same thing until your parents moved. We've had both sets of grandparents at baseball games, at soccer games, at spelling bees, at like whatever it is, they're here to be a part of the experience. Now my parents live in the same town we do, so
I adjust that slightly. So it's not just to be a part of the experience, or of course, like they want to witness their grandkids doing cool stuff. But I think there's more to it than that. I think that they themselves become part of that experience by their presence, right? They're showing their interest and they're demonstrating their support of very specific kinds of activities that our kids are a part of.
Well, and our kids notice
that plays a role.
And our kids want them to be there. And I think that's important too. And even now with dynamics of work and careers and all of that, if for some reason we are unable to attend something, which is rare, not only do our kids know that they have at least one parent there, but that they have caring adults, whether it's grandparents or friends or other family that come to a game to support them, to cheer them on, to watch them like grow and change and learn and strike out or score, whatever it is. And I think for a child, that's important to know that there are those people there to root you on, whether you're winning or losing, to see you at your best and unfortunately at your worst. But you have, a community of support. And we try and do the same. Now it's getting trickier now that my brother's kids are getting older and they're competing in sports and doing that. It's like we're often actually on fields at the same time on the same days, 10 towns away that we can't get there, but we try and show up when it matters and just beyond birthdays and to have that experience that we meet at the pool and that family is a part of it.
Right. And so all of that just reinforces by its sheer like presence and frequency, like just reinforces who you are, right? And you have multiple adults exemplifying that and reinforcing that for our kids.
Yeah, and I mean a lot of it has to do with like love and acceptance too.
Yeah.
I think it's harder to
no matter,
find that.
No matter what happens, you have a place and a people who know you and who love you and who will care for you.
Yeah.
Again, going back to Moana, just because the song at the beginning, at least watch the first like 15 minutes of the film, because like the most important character in the film is the grandmother, right? Not the parents. Parents don't have much of a role, but the grandmother certainly does. But that whole opening song like is like who you are.
I love when you sing on the
where
podcast.
you are, right? Kind of talking about the role that community plays.
But what I love about the grandmother in that is that, and I think this is true of any parent, we're very busy in the daily grind. And for us, and it's not an excuse, we have 4 kids. It's a lot. It's a lot. And they all need different things. But what never ceases to amaze me is whether it's my parents or your parents, they see things in our kids that sometimes that we don't catch. And they pay attention in special ways that parents cannot always pay attention because we're bogged down with stress and the management and the juggling. And so when they can speak words of truth or affirmation to our kids in a time that they need it, that we might have missed, I think that is really important.
Yeah.
And the same thing happens with teachers.
Teachers
Right?
can
We've
do
had
that as well.
amazing teachers for our children and in our schools. We've had, from administration all the way down to like the school nurse and the secretary that buzzes you in the building. And so when they know your kid and they even just have the right word at the right time, it makes all the difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Schools, I think, can often be seen as like transactional. Like, I've outsourced my my child's education to this building. They're going to deliver that product and then they send them home. But a school can be much more than that as well too. And that's why they have like a school mascot and a school song and like all these things that try to have that esprit de corps of community. Okay, so final thoughts.
It's important to have a lot of influences in your child's life, but you have to pay attention to who those people are and how they're leading, what they're saying, and the role that they play. Because we can't just ship them off to school and then hope that they're getting what we think that they need, or to a coach, or to, right? Like, we have to proactively like kind of listen and monitor even what's happening there, because it's just like giving a kid a screen.
Right. Well, it's not that we're sending them somewhere else, but that we are part of that community, and our kids, are then part of that community as well, and grow into that.
What's a thought that you had, kind of based on everything we've discussed?
I think that primarily, like, first of all, a parent is different than a peer. Like a peer can't set limits on a phone or issue a punishment, but a parent can. So a parent is different than a friend. And so I just look at my role as a parent and being like, it's okay. Like, I don't have to be a total dictator about things, but it's okay to set limits and to say no to the influences of peers and of culture that are not guiding them towards the type of young men or women that we want them to be. But what I'm realizing too is that it takes work to do that. It takes time to do that. And it also takes work and time to make sure that they are plugged into the kind of community and the other kinds of adults that we do want them to be. So I think a lot of it comes back to the kind of culture that we establish in the household and what's perceived as normal, especially now that they're young enough to still have enough sway over, turning them away from one thing or towards another thing. So a lot of this I know is cultural and it's community oriented, but we as parents really play that primary role in our own children's lives with what we choose to turn their attention towards.
Yeah. And oftentimes I feel like it can be like trying on clothes. It might take a while to find the right communities and the right places, that it's not just automatically going to fit or, be the right source of influence. Don't make fun of me.
Spoken like only a woman might understand
that was
that
rude
analogy,
and
right?
Sexist.
Well, I mean, anyway.
Everything fits you the same.
I put the pair of jeans on.
Not
and
everything
they
fits
just
me the
land.
same.
Yeah.
Sorry.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you everyone for joining with us. If you have someone in your life who might benefit from hearing about multi-generational influences, whether they have kids or whether they're all grown up and are thinking about the legacy that they leave their family, go ahead and share this episode with them. Also, if you haven't left a review for us yet, please head over to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating and a glowing review for us. And of course, subscribe to our email list at therelentlesspursuitpodcast.com.
Do you know that I often share podcasts that I listen to with my friends? Like, all I do is you just click on it and you hit the share button. It's really easy.
There's a simple share button.
So just share it.
Sharing is caring, folks. All right. Well, we hoped you enjoyed today's conversation. And this is episode 11.
Yeah.
Of our season. So we're going to be wrapping up season 4 within the next few weeks. So stay tuned for what we have ahead, and we'll look forward to speaking with you again next week.
Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to today's show. We hope you will use this conversation as a starting point for your own. We hope you're encouraged to think and act more intentionally.
If you want to learn more, you can visit our website, therelentlesspursuitpodcast.com, where you can find notes on today's show, plus additional blog posts, and you can subscribe to our free members list.
Please subscribe, leave a review, and share with your friends.
Facebook and Instagram are two great places to connect with us for daily doses of our quotable quotes, behind the scenes, and real-time photos, videos, and challenges.
Until next time, let us know how you are taking life off autopilot
And relentlessly pursuing what matters.